"Excuse me, sir, but you made a mistake in this part." Elias, a brilliant history student, has always found solace and clarity in the past, believing that every detail holds a key to the truth. But his world shatters when a moment of confusion leads to public humiliation in class. Just as he begins to question his own abilities, he uncovers a shocking mistake in a historical document by the very professor who laughed at him, setting in motion a series of events that will challenge his understanding of history and his place within it. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The scent of old paper and leather-bound books was Elias's sanctuary. It was a smell he associated with truth, with the quiet unraveling of time's great mysteries. In the hushed, cavernous halls of the university library's special collections, he wasn't just a student. He was a detective, a historian, a ghost hunter of sorts, piecing together the fragmented lives and events of the past. Elias, a history major in his final year, didn't just study history, he felt it. He felt the weight of the past generations pressing on his shoulders, an unspoken responsibility to get their stories right. He was in his element now, hunched over a desk, a pair of white cotton gloves protecting the brittle pages of a Civil War-era journal. The handwriting was spidery and faint, but Elias had trained his eyes to see what others missed. He had a meticulous mind, a product of a childhood spent poring over his grandfather's meticulously organized collection of historical essays and documentaries. His grandfather, a self-taught historian who never went to college, had instilled in him the core principle. History is not just a series of dates and names, but the living, breathing chronicle of human triumph and failure. The journal in his hands detailed a lesser-known skirmish, and Elias was cross-referencing it with a map from the period, a tiny smile playing on his lips as he found a detail that contradicted the widely accepted narrative. This was the thrill, the quiet, personal victory of finding a hidden piece of the puzzle. Elias wasn't a showman. He was the quiet student in the back of the lecture hall, the one who listened intently, who absorbed every word from his professors as if they were ancient wisdom. He was respected by his peers and, more importantly, by his professors, who saw in him a rare blend of passion and discipline. His relationship with Professor Anya Sharma, in particular, was one of mutual respect. She was an expert on 19th-century American political history, her lectures a masterclass in weaving complex narratives from disparate facts. Her sharp wit and encyclopedic knowledge made her a legend on campus. She was the one who had first encouraged him to delve into primary sources, to go beyond the textbook and seek out the true voices of history. "You have a gift, Elias," she'd said to him once after class, her gaze piercing. "A kind of instinct for the past. Don't let it gather dust." Her words had fueled his fire. Elias looked at his watch. He had another 2 hours before his next class, Professor Dalton's lecture on the early American Republic. Dalton was a newer, younger professor known for his flashy style and his popular textbook, a slick, modern version of history that, to Elias, felt a little too sanitized, too clean. Elias preferred the mess and grit of the real thing. Still, Dalton's class was mandatory for his major, and he made sure to be prepared, reading the assigned chapters twice and supplementing with his own research. His friend, Marcus, who was a political science major, often teased him about his dedication. "Man, you're reading for fun? Don't you ever just want to not think?" Marcus would ask, lounging on the quad, scrolling through his phone. Elias would just smile. "This is how I relax. It's a different kind of puzzle." To Elias, every historical figure was a character, every event a scene in a grand, epic play. He felt a profound connection to the figures he studied, especially those who had been overlooked or misrepresented. He was particularly drawn to the stories of unsung Black leaders and thinkers whose contributions had been deliberately obscured by time. He felt it was his duty to restore their voices, to shine a light on their triumphs and struggles. This was more than just an academic pursuit, it was a personal mission, a form of spiritual communion with his ancestors. His love for history was a silent vow, a pledge to remember. As he closed the journal carefully and returned it to the archivist, he felt a familiar sense of peace. He had spent the last 3 hours in a world long gone, and it had grounded him. Walking out of the library and into the crisp afternoon air, the campus bustled with the present. Students chattering, cars honking, music drifting from a dorm window. It was a jarring transition, but one he was used to. He pulled out his notes for Dalton's class, his mind already shifting gears from the 1860s to the 1790s, from the Civil War to the Constitutional Convention. He felt ready. He always felt ready. He couldn't have known that in a little over an hour, the quiet, comfortable world he had so meticulously built would be thrown into chaos, all because of a single simple question. The lecture hall was a world away from the hallowed quiet of the Special Collections Library. Here, the air buzzed with the nervous energy of 100 students, the low hum of laptops opening, and the last-minute chatter before class began. Professor Dalton swept in, not with the quiet reverence of a scholar, but with the energetic charisma of a performer. He was a younger man with a well-tailored tweed jacket and a slicked-back hairstyle that was just modern enough to seem effortless. He strode to the front of the room, a digital projector humming to life behind him, a stark contrast to the brittle journals Elias preferred. Dalton's lectures were slick and efficient, built around his own widely used textbook. He moved through the material with a practiced ease, his voice a smooth, confident baritone. Elias, seated in his usual spot toward the back, found himself taking fewer notes than he normally would. The information was presented as a series of bullet points and easily digestible facts, lacking the nuance and the human element he cherished. Still, he respected the professor's command of the room, and he knew this was a required course, a necessary step on his academic journey. He simply saw it as a different, less personal kind of learning. Midway through the lecture on the Constitutional Convention, Dalton paused, his eyes scanning the room as he toyed with a marker. So, a crucial point often overlooked is the fierce debate over federal power. Who can tell me what the core difference was between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan? I'm looking for the single most fundamental ideological split. It was a standard question, one Elias had answered in a dozen different ways for various assignments. He knew the answer intimately. The Virginia Plan, championed by James Madison, proposed a bicameral legislature with representation based on population, favoring larger states. The New Jersey Plan, a reaction to it, called for equal representation for all states, regardless of size. The fundamental split was simple: representation based on population versus representation based on statehood. A few hands went up tentatively, but Elias's was not among them. He preferred to let others try first. Dalton's eyes landed on him, a slight, knowing smile on his face. He knew Elias was one of the few students in the class who would have a complete, well-articulated answer. "Elias," Dalton said, his voice carrying an expectant tone, "you're a student of the sources. I'm sure you have a much more nuanced perspective for us." The attention of the class shifted. Elias felt a sudden, familiar surge of confidence. This was his field, his passion. He could do this in his sleep. He pushed his chair back slightly and cleared his throat. "The core difference," he began, his voice steady, "was the proposal for legislative representation. The Virginia Plan, it." And then it happened. A strange, disorienting fog descended upon his mind. The words, so familiar just moments ago, became jumbled, their meanings confused. The names of the plans, the concepts they represented, they all seemed to melt together into a single nonsensical blur. He knew the answer, he could see the concepts in his mind's eye, but he couldn't form the words. He tried again, forcing the words out. The Virginia Plan was for proportional representation based on the size of the population, but the New Jersey Plan was for a single house, and it was for the number of votes to be based on the number of states. He trailed off, his voice faltering. The last part of his sentence was gibberish, a chaotic echo of the correct answer. The New Jersey Plan called for equal representation, not the number of states. It was a simple, stupid mistake. The kind a freshman would make. A nervous silence filled the room, followed by a low, almost imperceptible murmur of confusion. Dalton's smile had vanished, replaced by a look of polite condescension. He waited a moment, allowing the awkward silence to hang in the air. "And what about the New Jersey Plan's proposal for the number of states, Elias?" "I confess that's not a term I'm familiar with," Dalton said, a hint of patronizing amusement in his voice. Elias's face flushed. He knew he had made a mistake. A big one. He tried to think, to correct himself, but the fog in his mind had only thickened, a dense, swirling cloud of confusion. I apologize, Professor. I misspoke. I mean it was based on a different system," he stammered, the words getting caught in his throat. A wave of snickering broke out. It started in the front row, a few students exchanging amused glances, and spread through the room like wildfire. It wasn't a loud, cruel sound, but it was a collective one. A unified sound of disbelief and shared humor at the expense of the student who was known for being the best. Dalton chuckled softly too. "It seems you've had a momentary lapse, Elias," Dalton said, his voice still smooth but now laced with a subtle mockery. He turned to the board and wrote the correct answer in bold, block letters. The fundamental difference was proportional versus equal representation. He underlined the words as if to emphasize Elias's failure. "It's a common point of confusion, I suppose. The devil is in the details, as they say." Elias slumped back in his chair, his mind reeling. The laughter, the quiet, shared mockery felt like a physical blow. He didn't understand what had happened. He had known the answer. He had known it better than anyone in that room. And yet, the words had failed him. His mind, the very tool he had honed and trusted his entire life, had betrayed him. He sat in stunned silence for the rest of the lecture, the words and diagrams on the screen blurring into an unintelligible mess. The taste of failure was bitter on his tongue. When class was dismissed, he didn't move. He sat there long after the room had emptied, the echo of the laughter still ringing in his ears. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a failure of his identity, a crack in the foundation of the person he had always been. He walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, a chill running down his spine, a question forming in his mind for the first time in his academic career. What if he wasn't as good as he thought he was? The days that followed the lecture were a blur of self-imposed exile. Elias did not return to the special collections. The scent of old paper and leather, once his greatest comfort, now felt like a taunt, a reminder of the knowledge that had so spectacularly failed him. He holed up in his dorm room, surrounded by his textbooks and notes, which now felt like silent accusers. He would try to read, but the words swam before his eyes. He would try to organize his thoughts for a paper, but the meticulously constructed mental architecture of his understanding of history had crumbled into dust. The image of Dalton's condescending smile and the sound of the class's snickers played on a relentless loop in his mind. It wasn't just a moment of public humiliation, it was an existential crisis. If he couldn't trust his own mind, his own instinct for the past, what was he? His phone buzzed with a message from Marcus, his well-meaning friend. "Dude, where have you been? You missed lunch. Everything good?" Elias didn't reply. He couldn't bring himself to talk about it, to articulate the shame that had burrowed deep into his bones. It felt too raw, too personal. It wasn't just a misspoken fact, it was a betrayal of his very identity. A few days later, a cryptic email landed in his inbox from Professor Anya Sharma. Her subject line was simple: history, memory, and truth. The body of the message was equally brief. "Elias, I was in the archives today and came across a quote I thought you might appreciate. The purpose of history is not to narrate the past, but to live it. I trust you understand what I mean. Come by my office when you can." The message was a lifeline, a gentle push back toward the world he had abandoned. It didn't mention the incident, but he knew she knew. Professor Sharma had that kind of perceptive understanding. She was reminding him that the truth of history wasn't found in a textbook or a lecture, but in the painstaking, personal search. Her words echoed his grandfather's sentiment, the very foundation of his love for the discipline. Reluctantly, Elias left his room. He didn't go to her office, not yet. First, he went to the library, but he found himself heading not for the special collections, but for the new media room. A small, temporary exhibit had been set up, showcasing the digitization of various faculty manuscripts and early drafts. His eyes scanned the room, avoiding eye contact with the few students present, his head down as if he were trying to disappear. He saw it from across the room, a large digital display featuring the work of Professor Dalton. It was a recent acquisition, a preliminary draft of his forthcoming book, A Comprehensive History of the Early American Republic. The title of the chapter on display was The Federalists and the Fissures of Power. Elias felt a flicker of revulsion. The same topic, the same professor. He wanted to turn away, but something, a morbid curiosity, held him there. He found a seat and pulled out his phone, linking to the exhibit's digital files. He began to scroll through the manuscript, his mind a cynical void. He was looking for any mistake, a small, insignificant error, but his heart wasn't in it. He scrolled past a beautifully written passage on Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. The prose was elegant, the narrative compelling, and the scholarship appeared unimpeachable. Dalton was a master of his craft, no doubt about it. Elias's own failure felt that much more profound. He was about to close the file when a single line caught his eye. It was a footnote, buried deep within the chapter's discussion of the compromise that led to the creation of the Treasury Department. With the final bill being signed on September 2, 1789, just a week after the Judiciary Act, cementing the financial architecture of the new government. That date, something about it felt off. It was such a specific detail and anchor point in the narrative. Elias's mind, which had been so foggy just days before, now began to sharpen. The date was wrong. He was certain of it. It was a quiet, deep-seated certainty, the same feeling he had when he found a hidden detail in a Civil War journal. He wasn't relying on a hazy memory or a jumbled thought. This was a core piece of information, one that he had memorized and cross-referenced dozens of times. He felt the familiar thrill, the quiet, focused energy of the detective. He opened a new browser tab and began to search, not with a vague query, but with the pinpoint precision of a surgeon. He pulled up digital archives of the Library of Congress and the National Archives. He found the congressional records from August and September of 1789. He meticulously scrolled through the handwritten ledgers, his eyes scanning for the entry. The Judiciary Act had been signed on September 24, 1789. The act creating the Treasury Department? September 2, 1789. The dates were flipped. It was a tiny error, a transcription mistake perhaps, but it was a mistake nonetheless, and it undermined the entire footnote's claim. His heart began to pound in his chest, a drum of disbelief and vindication. It wasn't him. His mind hadn't broken. His internal compass, his instinct for historical truth, was still intact. He just had to prove it. He began to search for other references to the signing dates, corroborating the information with at least 3 different primary sources. He found an early printing of the Federalist Papers with a margin note about the 2 acts, another early newspaper account that mentioned the order of the signings, and a letter from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson discussing the legislative calendar. All of them confirmed it. The Judiciary Act was signed after the Treasury Department Act. The error was so subtle, so seemingly inconsequential, that it was easy to miss. Dalton's narrative flowed smoothly, making the mistake almost invisible. But for Elias, it was a glaring contradiction, a crack in the foundation of the very authority that had laughed at him. He felt an intoxicating mix of vindication and indignation. The man who had mocked his momentary lapse had made a more fundamental mistake, one that was not a failure of memory but a failure of scholarship. Elias closed his laptop, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the screen, at the clean, confident prose of Professor Dalton, and the small, factual error that he had uncovered. His humiliation in the lecture hall, the crushing self-doubt he had carried for days, it all receded, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. He had found a mistake, not a simple one, but a genuine flaw in the work of an esteemed scholar. He had proof. The question that had plagued him for days was finally answered. He wasn't broken. But now, a new and much more profound question took its place. What was he going to do about it? The discovery of Professor Dalton's error was like a jolt of pure adrenaline, a shock to the system that had been in a state of self-imposed shutdown. The fog that had clouded Elias's mind dissipated instantly, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in days. He was no longer a victim of a cruel public failure. He was a historian again, a seeker of truth, and he had just found a critical piece of evidence. The question that remained was what to do with it. His first instinct was to print the documents and go directly to Professor Dalton's office, to lay the proof on his desk and watch him squirm. But a more strategic part of his mind, the same part that meticulously organized research and cross-referenced sources, told him that a private confrontation would do nothing to restore his standing. It would be a hollow victory, a whisper of vindication. This wasn't just about correcting a date. It was about correcting the narrative about him, about proving that his previous lapse was an anomaly, not a sign of fundamental incompetence. The platform had to be public, and it had to be a moment of unassailable intellectual honesty. He decided the perfect stage was the upcoming departmental lecture series, an event attended by the entire history faculty and a large number of graduate and undergraduate students. Professor Anya Sharma was scheduled to give the keynote address on the role of forgotten narratives, and he knew Professor Dalton would be there, sitting in the front row, basking in the academic spotlight. Elias spent the next several days preparing not a retort, but an argument. He didn't want to humiliate Dalton. He wanted to educate the room. His approach was not one of revenge, but of scholarly rigor. He dug deeper, finding more evidence to support his claim. He located a journal entry from a congressman at the time, noting with some frustration the rapid succession of key bills being signed and confusing their order. He found a personal letter from a colonial printer who was tasked with publishing the new laws, and who mentioned needing to hold the press for the Judiciary Act because the Treasury Act had been signed a week before and was already in the final stages of printing. He built a case so airtight it couldn't be disputed. He practiced his delivery not in front of a mirror, but by walking the floor of his room, reciting the facts in a calm, measured tone, purging his voice of any trace of the stammering, confused student who had stood at the front of Dalton's class. This wasn't just about the facts, it was about his own redemption. The day of the lecture arrived with the solemnity of a major academic event. The large auditorium was filled to capacity, a mix of curious students, respected scholars, and an array of faculty members. Elias arrived early, taking a seat in the very back, a safe distance from the front row where Professor Dalton sat, a picture of confident authority. When Professor Sharma took the stage, the room fell silent. Her lecture was, as always, brilliant. She spoke with a quiet passion about the hidden histories of marginalized groups, of the importance of primary sources, and the moral duty of the historian to find the truth, no matter how inconvenient. Her words resonated with Elias, a silent validation of his own life's work, a reminder of the mission he had briefly forgotten. When the lecture concluded, Professor Sharma opened the floor for questions. A microphone was set up in the aisle and students lined up. The questions were polite and predictable at first, ranging from follow-ups on her specific research to general queries about the field. Elias waited, his heart pounding a steady rhythm against his ribs. He watched as the line dwindled, his moment drawing closer. When it was his turn, he stepped up to the microphone, feeling 100 eyes turn his way. He could feel the weight of their collective memory, the boy who had been laughed out of class. He stood tall, his posture straight, his head held high. He began not with an accusation, but with a question framed in the language of a true scholar. "Professor Sharma, thank you for a truly inspiring lecture. It made me think about the ghosts in our archives. Those small, almost invisible details that can reframe entire narratives. In that spirit, I was recently reviewing some primary sources from the First Congress. There seems to be a common misconception in some historical scholarship regarding the sequence of two foundational pieces of legislation, the Judiciary Act and the Act creating the Treasury Department." Elias paused, his eyes sweeping across the room. He could see Dalton's face, a look of polite boredom that was quickly shifting to one of mild interest. The room was silent, waiting. While many accounts, including some published works, claim the Treasury Act was signed a week after the Judiciary Act, a careful review of the legislative calendar and contemporary letters reveals the opposite. The Judiciary Act was actually signed on September 24, 1789, while the Act creating the Treasury Department was signed on September 2. The Treasury Department, in fact, predates the Judiciary Act. Could you speak to the significance of these small chronological details and how they might alter our understanding of the priorities of the new government? The question was brilliant. It was not a direct attack but a sophisticated query that placed the burden of proof on the existing scholarship. The room buzzed with a low murmur. Professor Sharma, ever the graceful scholar, turned to Dalton, who was a known expert on that period. "Professor Dalton, since this is in your area, perhaps you could offer some insight?" she said with a slight, knowing smile. Dalton rose, a tense stiffness in his posture. He cleared his throat. "Well, Elias, that's an interesting point, but I believe the accepted consensus is that the acts were signed in quick succession, and the exact order is of minor significance. My research indicates that the Judiciary Act—" "I have the sources here, Professor," Elias interrupted gently, holding up his phone to the microphone. "I cross-referenced the Library of Congress archives, the National Archives, and two separate contemporary news clippings from September of 1789. All three confirm the dates and the sequence. The Judiciary Act was, in fact, signed on September 24, 3 weeks after the Treasury Act." Dalton's face went pale. The polite mask fell away, revealing a flash of genuine shock, then anger. He was speechless. The auditorium, which had been buzzing with whispers, fell into a collective, stunned silence. Professor Sharma, watching the exchange with a keen, analytical eye, stepped forward. "Elias," she said, her voice clear and commanding, "that is an extraordinary finding. It demonstrates precisely the kind of diligent, primary source-based research that distinguishes a true historian. It's a testament to the fact that even the most established narratives can be challenged with new evidence." She turned to the rest of the faculty. "In light of this, I believe Elias's research deserves a full and proper hearing. We will make time in our next departmental meeting for him to present his findings in full." She then turned to the audience. "This is what history is truly about. Not memorizing dates, but questioning them." The room erupted into applause, not a condescending chuckle, but a genuine, thundering sound of appreciation. The applause wasn't for Professor Sharma, not entirely. It was for Elias. He had stood in the fire of his humiliation, and with a single, unassailable truth, had not just survived, but emerged victorious. Dalton sat down, defeated, his face a mask of silent fury. As the crowd began to disperse, several faculty members came up to him, their faces a mix of awe and respect. A few minutes later, two men in tailored suits, recruiters for a historical research firm, approached him. "Mr. Elias," one of them said, extending a hand. "That was one of the most impressive displays of scholarship we've seen in a long time. We'd like to talk to you about some opportunities." Elias shook his hand, the firm grip a stark contrast to the shaky hands that had held his laptop just an hour ago. He looked around the emptying auditorium, at the podium where Professor Sharma still stood, and then at the door leading out into the campus. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He had faced his greatest academic fear and had not only overcome it, but had turned it into his greatest triumph. His quiet, personal mission was now a public, resounding success. The archivist's paradox, he realized, was not about being lost in the past, but about finding a way to make it relevant to the future. The applause from the auditorium followed Elias out into the twilight, a warm, resonant hum that was a stark contrast to the hollow echo of laughter that had haunted him for days. He wasn't walking. He was floating, a mixture of adrenaline and vindication propelling him down the path toward the campus green. His phone, a silent brick just an hour ago, was now a constant source of vibration. Emails from professors he barely knew, texts from classmates he hadn't spoken to since the incident, and even a missed call from his department head. The world was suddenly and unequivocally open to him again. The two recruiters from Lexicon Historical Associates, Mark and David, caught up with him just as he reached the central fountain. They were a study in professional polish, their suits a dark, unassuming counterpoint to the more relaxed academic attire of the university. "Mr. Elias, thank you again for a moment of your time," Mark said, his smile genuine and his handshake firm. "That was truly remarkable. We specialize in untangling complex historical narratives for a wide range of clients. Corporations, legal firms, even government agencies. We're often hired to trace a company's origins, establish land rights, or verify claims for a historical registry. What you did today in real time and in front of a difficult crowd is exactly the kind of work we do." David, the quieter of the two, chimed in. "It's not dusty archives and academic papers. It's about finding the one missing piece of the puzzle that changes everything. We call it historical due diligence." They led Elias to a small private cafe off campus, a place of hushed tones and dark wood. Over a cup of tea they laid out their offer. It was audacious. Lexicon wasn't looking for a graduate student. They were looking for a mind like his. They proposed a full-time, salaried position after graduation, with a substantial signing bonus. His first assignment would be to work with a team to verify the provenance of a major collection of pre-Civil War documents. The work was fast-paced, high-stakes, and had a tangible, real-world impact. "You have a unique ability, Elias," Mark continued, his voice low and serious. "Most people look at the big picture and see a story. You look at a tiny detail and see the entire foundation. That's a rare gift. We're prepared to offer you the resources and the platform to use it." The offer was more than a job. It was an acknowledgement of his specific, almost obsessive talents. It was the promise of a future where his love for the past could be a practical, profitable skill. It was tempting, exhilarating, and completely at odds with the life he had always envisioned for himself. A life of quiet scholarship, of writing books and teaching. He thanked them and told them he needed time to think. He needed to talk to the one person he knew would understand. He found Professor Sharma in her office, a sanctuary overflowing with books, journals, and a faint scent of old paper and coffee. She was at her desk, a small smile on her face. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice soft. "And I have to say, that was one of the most brilliant gambits I have ever witnessed. You didn't just correct a mistake. You demonstrated why it matters. You turned a moment of weakness into a moment of profound strength." Elias told her about the recruiters, about Lexicon, and the offer they had made. He laid out the details of the job, the money, the opportunity. He watched her face as he spoke, searching for a sign of disapproval or concern. She listened patiently, her expression unreadable. "That's a remarkable opportunity," she said when he was finished. "And they're right about you. You have a special gift. Most historians have to work for years to earn a reputation. You did it in 5 minutes at a microphone." She leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "But I would caution you, Elias. This is a very different world. It's a world where the truth is a commodity, where the client dictates the scope, and where the narrative is often shaped by the person paying for it. In academia, our mission is to find the truth no matter where it leads. The only client we serve is the past." I always wanted to be like you," Elias confessed, the words a raw whisper. "I always saw myself in a place like this." Professor Sharma smiled gently. "You still can be. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I'm working on a new project, a comprehensive digital archive of the civil rights movement, focusing on unpublished oral histories. It's a massive undertaking and it needs someone with your eye for detail. I'd like to offer you a position as my research assistant for the next year, with the possibility of co-authoring a paper. It's not the glamour or the money of Lexicon, but it's a chance to do the work you love, the work you were born to do on your own terms." He had 2 paths before him. One was a well-funded, exciting adventure into the world of applied history, where his skills would be a valuable asset in the marketplace. The other was a more traditional, noble path, a quiet dedication to scholarship, a chance to work with a mentor he deeply respected. He was caught between the siren call of a new, unexpected future and the pull of the dream he had nurtured his entire life. As he was leaving Professor Sharma's office, he almost ran into Professor Dalton. Dalton was not smiling. His face was a tight mask of cold fury, his eyes devoid of their usual warmth. He stopped and stared at Elias, a silent, seething energy emanating from him. "You played your hand well, Elias," Dalton said, his voice a low growl. "But don't think this is over. Academia is a small world. You're a brilliant young man, yes, but talent isn't everything. It's about knowing who your allies are and who you've just made an enemy of. You came for me and you found what you were looking for. I just hope you realize the consequences." Elias stood his ground. He didn't flinch. The old fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, determined calm. "I didn't come for you, Professor," he said, his voice steady. "I came for the truth. And I found it." He walked past Dalton, leaving the professor standing alone in the hallway, his veiled threat hanging in the air. The words were a sobering reminder that his victory, no matter how sweet, had consequences. But as he left the building and stepped back into the evening air, he didn't feel fear. He felt a sense of purpose. He was no longer a student who had made a mistake. He was an archivist who had found a paradox, a scholar who had defended a truth, and a man with a choice to make. The future, in all its confusing, terrifying, and exciting possibilities, was finally his to decide. The exhilaration from the lecture hall had a half-life of its own. It fizzled out somewhere between the campus fountain and the door to his dorm room, replaced by a dense, suffocating silence. Elias sat on his bed, the glow of his laptop illuminating the chaos of his unread emails and messages. A full-time high-paying job. A signing bonus. A chance to work with a prestigious firm on high-stakes, real-world projects. The numbers were staggering, a promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. The offer from Professor Sharma, in contrast, was a return to his old life, but with a new title and a higher purpose. A quiet, diligent path of pure scholarship. A chance to work with a woman who had seen his potential even when he couldn't see it himself. He felt like a man standing at a crossroads. To his left, a brightly lit highway full of speed and promise. To his right, a quiet, winding trail, familiar but more challenging than ever. The choice was not between good and bad, but between two versions of himself. A knock at his door broke his reverie. It was Marcus holding a pizza box. "Dude, I've been trying to get a hold of you. You're basically a legend on campus right now. A total boss move. You humiliated Dalton in front of the whole department." Elias took a slice of pizza, the taste of which was completely lost to him. "It wasn't about humiliation," he said, his voice quiet. "It was about getting it right." Marcus shrugged. "Same difference, man. The result is the same. The dude who laughed at you is now eating his words, literally and figuratively. I saw him leave the auditorium. He looked like he'd been hit by a truck." Marcus took a big bite of pizza, then looked at Elias, his expression softening. "But seriously, man. You okay? That was intense." Elias told Marcus about the two offers, the corporate one and the academic one. Marcus listened with an intensity that only a business student could muster. When Elias was done, Marcus's eyes were wide. "You're not even considering it, right?" Marcus said, his voice tinged with a disbelieving awe. "The lexicon offer? That's it. That's the dream. You work for a few years, build a reputation, and then you can do whatever you want. That's real power, Elias. That's real influence. Professor Sharma's offer is nice. It's safe. It's what you always thought you wanted, but what you just did today showed you're capable of so much more. You're not a research assistant. You're a disruptor. You found a flaw in a master's work. What do you think you could do with a team and unlimited resources?" Elias heard the logic. It was airtight. Marcus was right in a way. The corporate path promised more, demanded more, and offered a different kind of impact. It was history as a weapon, a tool, a solution. It was tangible and immediate. It was an end to the academic struggle, the quiet life of a scholar. "I don't know," Elias said, running a hand over his face. "I always wanted to write a book. To teach. To be like Professor Sharma." "And you still can," Marcus insisted. "But from a position of power. You don't have to be a dusty academic to be a historian, man. You can be a mover and a shaker. You can change how companies think about their past. You can change how the law is interpreted based on documents no one else has looked at. This isn't just a job offer, Elias. It's a new field. You could be a pioneer." Marcus's words lingered in the air long after he had left, a seductive melody playing against the quiet, persistent drumbeat of Elias's own desires. He knew Marcus was right on a purely practical level. The lexicon offer was the smart choice, the logical choice. But logic had very little to do with the love he felt for history, for the feel of a crumbling document in his hands, for the silent conversations he had with the past in the archives. He thought about his grandfather, the old man who had taught him that history wasn't in books, but in the echoes of the human experience. He went to the library, to the reading room he had so carefully avoided. He found the familiar quiet, the scent of paper and old wood. He didn't open a book. He just sat, breathing it all in. This was his sanctuary, his home. The thought of leaving it, of turning history into a product to be sold, felt like a betrayal. A small detail, a minor date change, that was all it took for him to see how history was so often used as a tool to justify or to condemn. He had chosen to use it to correct, to seek truth. Could he do that under the employ of a company? Or would he be forced to find the truth that a client was paying for? He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. The next morning he received an email from Professor Dalton. The subject line was simply, "Meeting." The body of the email was a terse directive. "I have reviewed your final paper on the causes of the American Revolution. See me in my office tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. sharp. Your grade has been posted." Elias checked the student portal. His grade was AB-. It was a decent grade, but for a student of his caliber who had consistently earned A's in Dalton's classes, it felt like a slap in the face. The professor had found a way to deliver on his threat. The grade itself wouldn't sink him, but AB- from a class on his transcript, especially from a professor who had once been an ally, could be a black mark. It was a subtle but effective attack. Elias walked into Professor Sharma's office an hour later, the B still a bitter taste in his mouth. "I've made my decision," he said, handing her a formal letter. "I'm turning down Lexicon's offer." Professor Sharma's eyes widened, then softened with a gentle, knowing smile. "I'm not surprised, Elias. I've known you long enough to know what you value. and I'm accepting your offer to be your research assistant. I'm ready to start whenever you are, Elias said, the words feeling like a physical weight being lifted off his chest. Excellent, she said, and then without missing a beat she said, I think we should start with a small, seemingly insignificant detail from a civil rights document. There's a note in one of the archives about a woman who was a leader in a local activist group, but her last name is spelled differently in 2 different documents. Most people would ignore it, but I have a feeling you won't. Elias felt a surge of energy, a jolt of recognition. She was giving him a test, not of his memory but of his instinct. He had made his choice. He had chosen the quiet, winding path, and he had a feeling it was going to be the most exciting journey of his life. He was ready to find the next forgotten detail, to follow the next breadcrumb of truth, and to become the historian he was always meant to be. Elias's new role as Professor Sharma's research assistant was everything he had hoped for, and nothing like he had expected. He wasn't just a glorified archivist, he was a co-conspirator in a grand intellectual heist. Their target, the forgotten, the overlooked, and the purposefully obscured narratives of the civil rights movement. The project was ambitious, a digital, interactive archive of oral histories, correspondence, and local news clippings that had never made it into the mainstream academic conversation. It was a labyrinth of information, and Professor Sharma had given him a single, seemingly insignificant thread to pull on, the misspelled last name of a local activist. Most people would see it as a typo, she had said on his first day. But what if it isn't? What if it's a clue to a story we don't know? The 2 spellings were Covington and Covington. Elias started with a simple search, cross-referencing the activist's first name, Loretta, with both variations. He found nothing in the major online archives. This wasn't a problem for him, it was a challenge. He dove into the primary sources, the digital scans of old, brittle documents from the local library's special collections. He spent days sifting through handwritten membership lists from local community groups, faded mimeographed flyers for protest rallies, and transcribed interviews. He finally found it in a digitized copy of a small local newspaper from 1963. A photo of a woman, identified as Loretta Covington, standing at a protest with a group of women. The photo's caption noted that she was a leader of the local chapter of the Women's Political Council. This was significant. He then found a transcribed interview with her, where she spoke about her family's move from rural Alabama to the city for better opportunities. The interviewer noted her distinct accent and the fact that she had to spell out her last name twice. The interviewer had written it down incorrectly the first time as Covington. The T sound was often indistinguishable from a soft D in her dialect. It was a tiny human detail, a simple phonetic confusion that had obscured a pivotal figure from the historical record. Elias had found the thread. He had proven his instinct right. But the story didn't end there. He kept digging. Following the Covington spelling, he found a separate set of documents related to a lesser-known protest at a segregated lunch counter. A handwritten note from a student activist, addressed to Loretta Covington, mentioned a clandestine meeting with the architect. The name, the architect, was intriguing. The note mentioned an elaborate plan to disrupt local business in a way that wouldn't violate city ordinances. Elias felt the familiar surge of intellectual excitement. This wasn't about a simple typo. It was about a hidden history, a secret collaboration that had never been documented in the official record. He took his findings to Professor Sharma. She was impressed but not surprised. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd find," she said. "Now we have to find out who the architect was. This sounds like an organized, strategic effort that we've never seen documented. It could change everything we know about how these local movements operated. It could reveal that the groundswell of support was more coordinated than we ever thought." Their work became a true partnership. They spent their days in the archives, chasing down every mention of the architect and Loretta Covington. Their efforts uncovered a network of highly educated, anonymous individuals, lawyers, urban planners, and engineers, who were secretly providing strategic guidance and financial support to local activists. They were the unseen architects of the movement, the people who drew up the blueprints for the boycotts and sit-ins. Their work was kept secret to protect them from both legal and social retribution, as they were often white or people of color with high-profile jobs in the community. Their role in the movement was completely erased from the history books. Meanwhile, Professor Dalton's quiet vendetta continued. He wasn't loud or obvious. His methods were subtle, a series of small, calculated attacks. He managed to get Elias's name removed from a prestigious undergraduate research conference committee. He spread a rumor that Elias was abandoning academia for corporate work, a rumor that was now half true and half false. He even went so far as to give a lecture on the importance of scholarly integrity and the dangers of sensationalist historical claims, a clear reference to Elias's impromptu lecture. The attacks, however, lost their power. Elias was too busy, too engaged in his work to notice. He had a new purpose. He wasn't focused on vindication anymore. He was focused on discovery. He and Professor Sharma were building a narrative from the ground up, finding the human stories behind the major events. They were giving a voice to the voiceless, bringing light to the shadows of the past. It was hard, thankless work, but it was the most important thing he had ever done. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone. He was a historian, a true one, and his work was his proof. The climax of their research came in the form of a single, cryptic photograph. It was a black and white photo of a meeting in a basement, a gathering of a dozen people. A woman, whom they identified as Loretta Covington, was in the corner. But the focus was on a man in the center of the photo. He was smiling, a half-shadowed face. He was not a famous figure. He was an engineer, a man who had gone on to design bridges and buildings. But in the notes accompanying the photo, written in a different hand, was a single, simple caption: "The Architect." Elias and Professor Sharma had found their man, and the evidence of a secret, organized, and effective network of activists and professionals who worked in the shadows. It was a small detail, a single photograph in a box of old documents, but it changed everything. The forgotten had a face and a name. Their silent contribution would be silent no more. The photograph of the architect was not just a historical find. It was the capstone of Elias's vindication. It was the irrefutable evidence that his instincts, honed over a lifetime of quiet study, were not just valid but transformative. He and Professor Sharma spent the next 6 months building their case, meticulously documenting every clue, every transcribed conversation, every newspaper clipping that pointed to the existence of this hidden network. They were piecing together a new history, one that was far more complex and organized than the grand narratives in textbooks. They had found the human-level, tactical stories that fueled a larger, systemic movement, and their work was poised to rewrite a chapter of American history. They submitted their findings to a prestigious academic journal. The peer review process was rigorous and, at times, brutal. One of the anonymous reviewers was, unbeknownst to them, Professor Dalton. He did not object to the paper outright, but instead he used his review to launch a series of subtle but devastating critiques. He nitpicked their sources, questioned their interpretations, and cast doubt on the very existence of the architect as a key figure, claiming they were overstating the importance of a single, unverified photograph. He was using his academic influence to slowly bleed their project of its credibility. Elias and Professor Sharma worked tirelessly to rebut every point, providing additional evidence and contextualizing their claims. It was a war of attrition, and Elias felt the old frustration creeping back in, the feeling that his work was being dismissed not on its merits, but because of a personal vendetta. Then an email arrived from Lexicon Historical Associates. It was from Mark, the senior recruiter. "Elias," it read, "I know you turned down our offer and I respect your decision. However, we're currently working on a high-stakes legal case for a Fortune 500 company. Their claim to a piece of historically significant land is being contested, and the opposing side has brought in a historical expert. We've been asked to find any and all evidence to refute his claims. We were told this expert is known for his detailed, aggressive work." Elias read the name of the expert in the next paragraph, Professor Arthur Dalton. A cold knot formed in Elias's stomach, then slowly untangled into a sense of clarity. Dalton wasn't just working against him in academia. He was applying his skills in the professional world, where the stakes were far higher than a journal article. This wasn't just about winning a debate, it was about money, property, and power. It also confirmed that Dalton was a known commodity in the corporate world, hired for his ability to find flaws and inconsistencies in opposing arguments. Elias called Mark immediately. "Mark," he said, "I have to know more about this case. I think I might be able to help." Mark was surprised but quickly laid out the details. The case centered on a series of land deeds from the 1850s. The opposing side's argument, spearheaded by Dalton, rested on a specific clause in the deed, which seemed to invalidate the current company's claim. Dalton's historical analysis was airtight. He had found a single forgotten phrase in the document that seemed to change the entire legal interpretation of the deed. It was exactly the kind of move Elias would have made. "I need to see the original document," Elias said. "And I need access to all of Dalton's source material." Mark was hesitant, but Elias's reputation and his prior work were enough to convince him. Lexicon sent him a digitized copy of the deed and Dalton's historical report. Elias spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyperfocus, poring over every word, every footnote, every source. He wasn't looking for a mistake in Dalton's logic. He was looking for a detail Dalton had missed. He found it, not in the main body of the document but in the margins. In the original 1850s deed, a small handwritten note was scribbled in the margin, so faded it was almost invisible. It was a note from a notary, referencing a separate legal codicil that had been adopted by the city 2 years earlier. That codicil was a procedural amendment that changed how such deeds were to be interpreted. It made Dalton's core argument completely invalid. Dalton had analyzed the primary document, but he had failed to cross-reference it with the contemporary laws in place at the time. It was the same kind of error he had made with the Federalist speech, a failure to account for all the details. Elias wrote a counter-report, a scathing and brilliant piece of work that not only refuted Dalton's claims but also exposed his methodological flaw. He presented his findings to Lexicon's legal team. They were stunned. The report was a masterpiece of historical due diligence, and it changed the entire course of the lawsuit, forcing the opposing side to withdraw its claim. In the end, Elias got his wish. He never went to work for Lexicon, but his work on the case solidified his reputation as a scholar with a unique and powerful ability to use historical details to solve modern problems. The academic journal, having seen the outcome of the lawsuit and the legal team's glowing testimony, finally published their paper. Professor Sharma's project became a major success, and they were heralded as pioneers in their field. As for Professor Dalton, his reputation took a severe hit. The legal team he had advised and the historical society he was working for both cut ties with him. He had chosen to use his gift for personal gain, and it had backfired spectacularly. His final act of spite, the B on Elias's transcript, was now a hollow gesture. A year later, Elias stood in front of his first class of undergraduates. He was a junior professor, his own book on the civil rights movement project in progress. He started the class with a question just as Professor Dalton had. A shy, young student in the front row raised his hand and gave a wrong answer. A nervous laugh rippled through the classroom. Elias smiled gently. "That's a good answer," he said, "but let's look at the details. A single detail can change everything." He had found his purpose not in a big, grand pronouncement, but in the smallest, most forgotten of places. He was not just a historian. He was an archivist of the human heart, a seeker of truth in a world of paradoxes. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.